We're watching Montgomery County Republican Club's Direct Line program with our special guest, Dr. Garcia-Bengochea, MD. He's of Cuban descent, and he is going to be speaking with our hosts, Mark Unkerfer and Don Irvine, about everything that's going on in Cuba. Take it away, guys.
Well, there's a lot of news coming out of Cuba right now, and obviously this is something that sort of it takes a lot of turmoil to break through the news. Briefly, what is going on right now?
So, as you've seen on TV, there have been mass protests in Cuba across many cities, probably with hundreds of thousands, if not even 1 million people. This is unprecedented in some ways in Cuba. There have always been points where the pot boiled and there would be a protest somewhere in a Cuban city. But these people came to the streets as a combination of events, really. The ongoing poverty and mismanagement of the government, the awful healthcare facilities, and I speak authoritatively on that because not only am I a physician, but I've been to Cuba and looked at these hospitals, and they're atrocious. And then the COVID, the pandemic, cut off what is the economic lifeline from day to day in Cuba, which is the tourist industry. And so these people finally hit the streets, and there has been a lot of confusion over why. But all you have to do is listen to these people. They were not asking for vaccines. They were not asking for food, although they are starving. They are not asking for infrastructure, although in Havana, 2 buildings collapse every week. They have a surf site every month. They were asking for none of that, including not one person asked for the embargo to be lifted. What they asked for was liberty, libertad. And the other thing they said very clearly was abajo la dictadura, down with the dictatorship. These people have lost everything. And finally, they lost the one crucial element, which is their fear of the dictatorship.
It's interesting. One of the things about Cuba, and I think it's a fair characterization, is over the years that it's been propped up externally. So there was a long period of time in which the Soviet Union was buying sugar at inflated price. I mean, there were a variety of ways in which they conducted subsidies. Obviously, the Soviet Union ceased to be a factor, and I think Russia fairly quickly dropped those subsidies. And in the meantime, and then there was a period of time where the Venezuelans were providing cheap oil. It was like a whole resale arrangement. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, what has been propping up the regime economically in recent years?
So there have been different dynamics over 60 years, and clearly the 30 years under Soviet domination, I would say, was an entirely different episode or period in Cuban history than what would follow, which was the rise, and now we see the fall of the Venezuelan situation. And then now Cuba for what it is or has left, which is 3 things that I'll touch on here in a moment. But let's go back to the Soviet period. There was a Faustian arrangement there. The Cubans would receive subsidies from the Soviet Union in terms of food and oil and basic necessities in exchange for fighting and dying around the world, the Cubans, for Soviet expansionism. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Raul Castro, who, by the way, is the longest serving head of a military in world history, still is today. Raul Castro went to the apocalyptic Fidel, socialism or death, and said, look, we have a serious problem here. We're going to have to repatriate tens of thousands of troops. And when they come and find the disastrous situation we're in economically, because we've destroyed the sugar industry, the cattle industry, the mining industry, all that has been destroyed, we have to do something to placate these people and preserve their loyalty, or there's going to be a coup d'etat. And so they very shrewdly set up a financial entity outside of the Cuban government composed entirely of the military, the generals and so forth, where General Lopez would own the buses, Rodriguez, the hotels, and they took the tourist industry because all that really remained in Cuba, of course, were the natural resources, beautiful beaches, great weather, and the indomitable spirit of the Cuban people. And so they recreated the tourist industry, and that is under control of the Cuban military. Now, going back to the Soviet period, the foreign policy of Cuba, in addition to fighting and dying for the Soviets, was to export their revolution. Fidel Castro very famously said, "We will have 1,000 Vietnams." And so particularly in Latin America, Central and South America, the Castros began creating these independence movements, what we would call terrorist groups. So M19 in Colombia, the FARC in Colombia, the Shining Path in Peru, the Sandinistas in Central America. All these are franchises or splinter groups of the Cuban Revolution. And in doing this, they became heavily involved in narco trafficking. And of course, the exportation of Cuban socialism is responsible for the poverty and the corruption and the violence and the subversion of democratic institutions throughout Latin America, which has created a migration crisis, obviously. No one wants to leave their home. They leave because of intolerable circumstances. In this process, they were cultivating different leaders throughout Latin America. Lula and Dilma in Brazil, Morales in Bolivia, and in particular, a young military man, I think he was a colonel at the time, Hugo Chavez. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba went through a 10-year period or so, or 8-year period that Fidel famously called the special period. It really was of starvation. But in that time, they were able to cultivate Chavez and put him in charge in Venezuela. And they then set up an arrangement where the Cubans would protect Chavez and perpetuate him in exchange for oil. So the Cubans relied on this petro state, if you will, to sustain themselves from around 2000 until about 2013, 2014, when the wheels started coming off economically in Venezuela. And that's when they began to really make the push hard for the only option they had left, which was the United States, and in particular through the tourist industry.
So that actually interesting segue, because that's about the time, correct me if I'm wrong, I hope, that the Obama administration responded to that, and there were some initial efforts to open things up to change the policy of the United States that we had for, I guess at that point, about 50 plus years. There are obviously some legal, maybe this is a good time to talk about some of the legal issues, the Helms Act. I mean, there's some good sound reasons why it's a little hard to go directly to trade, because there are some, how shall I say, consequences for the past action of the Cubans that need to be addressed first before it's possible for them to be part of the mainstream trade arrangements. That may be a bit of an elliptical way of describing things. Maybe you can put it a little bit more succinctly.
Let's go back to the beginning and let's talk about the embargo in particular.
Right.
The embargo was an economic sanction for the theft of 5,913, the property theft against 5,913 Americans. Plain and simple. The expropriation without confiscation in violation of international law, by anyone's standards, of these properties. And of course, with the Cold War being fuel on the fire, the embargo took on more of an ideological sense over those 30 years under the Soviets in Cuba. But effectively, that's how the embargo began. It was an economic sanction for theft. And every country had an embargo against Cuba at the same time the United States began their embargo, originally on October 19th, 1960, after the mass confiscation of almost 400 privately owned Cuban businesses. But by 1962, the embargo was put in place in full. And during that period, every country, Spain, Mexico, Canada, Great Britain, all instituted sanctions, embargoes, isolation of Cuba. Over the years, Cuba would settle those property debts. For example, with Switzerland, the Swiss discovered pretty early on that Swiss chocolate wasn't very good without Cuban sugar. So they cut a deal that where the Swiss taxpayer actually paid for the properties that were confiscated by Swiss citizens. But this is how the embargo began. The embargo today and over the years really is comprised of four laws. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which gives the president really extraordinary powers in times of, quote, war or hostility. And that's where the Cuban Assets Control Regulations come from, which is kind of the backbone, if you will, of the embargo. In 1964, that was expanded, if you will, specifically to Cuba, the Trading with the Enemy Act, in the Cuban Assets Control Regulations. In 1992, the Torricelli Act, or the Cuba Democracy Act, came into play. And basically that made tourism to Cuba illegal. Mind you, during the Soviet era with the Cold War, no one would really, maybe with the exception, I think it was Bill de Blasio, who did his honeymoon in Cuba, was thinking about going to Cuban beaches. And in fact, Cuba had on average about 50 to 80,000 tourists a year. So it was not really a tourist destination. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, the concern was that they would exploit with this new financial entity, tourism. And then it produced certain international sanctions for people who did business with Cuba. If a boat had been in a Cuban port, it could not come to a U.S. port for 180 days. The Helms-Burton Act in 1996 went on to actually codify the embargo, take many of the provisions in the Cuban Assets Control Regulation, which are subject to the discretion of the president in terms of their implementation and enforcement. It codified these. And one of the principal things that it did was it allowed American citizens who had property claims in Cuba to sue traffickers in U.S. courts, which had been considered not standard in international law because of the separation of powers issues and the challenge to the sovereignty of the Cubans. But it was very controversial, and ironically, it came with a waiver of that cause of, or that right to action every 6 months, and that became actually the underpinning for corporations to do business in Cuba. They actually relied on the President of the United States to put that waiver of those lawsuits into place every 6 months, so they could go do business in Cuba without taking any risk, or with taking minimal risk. And that changed, as you all know, on May 2nd, 2019. In fact, I was the first person to file suit against Carnival Cruise Lines for trafficking in property that had been owned by my extended family, including an American citizen whose claim was certified by the Treasury in 1971. And then in 2000, the Trade Sanctions and Export Relief Enhancement Act allowed for food and medicine to be sold to the, and by the way, that was in the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, but it made it codified, allowing selling food and medicine to the Cubans. And the only caveat being that the Cubans could have no credit. They had to pay cash up front. So those are really what comprise the embargo. But the embargo, if you wanted to distill it into one sentence, is effectively a sanction for any American who wants to do business with the Cuban military. There, as Marco Rubio said the other day on the Senate, there are not ships that are encircling the island. Cuba can trade with whomever they want. And look at the United States. We import $40 or $50 billion worth of computer hardware from the Chinese, and software as well. Cars from Mexico and Germany, food from Brazil, oil from Canada. They could trade with all these people, and they have. And that was this notion about the embargo being insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different result. Well, that's not the case. It is. I won't go so far to say myth that the embargo is to overthrow the regime, but it is to empower the Cuban people, to create the external environment for them to have their basic political and human rights.
So let me go back. There was a period. I mean, obviously, you've talked about you referenced the change of policy. Well, there've been a couple of changes of policy, and I think because we're in the Biden administration, it may be worth kind of going step by step through that process. So there was a period during the Obama administration where there was an effort to open things up. Was this were these waivers? How would you describe that process?
Well, so it was very interesting that because probably the most surprising thing is that I did not realize what an American exceptionalist Barack Obama was. Obama's theory was that capitalism, American capitalism particularly not any other form of capitalist exchange, but American capitalism, and in this case really tourism, was going to be transformative in Cuba and allow the dictatorship to see the error of their ways and reform them. And of course, I went to the Obama administration and I said, look, I mean, that's a great Christmas wish, like wishing for the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. But how can capitalism work, much less be transformative in a country where everything is stolen? There is no clear title to anything, including patents and trademarks, or at least trademarks. Everything is stolen. How do you have collateral? How do you service debt or get, borrow money? And this is really crazy. But Obama launched in. Now, the Cubans, interestingly, in the early 90s, when they realized that they had to rely on tourist dollars, certainly in the short run for hard currency, as I said, they took what was left of old Havana, they modernized it. They started building hotels and joint ventures with the Spaniards and others. But they also worried very much about the effects of capitalists, tourists coming from other countries, and infecting the new man, the Cuban, with capitalist values. So they created a second currency expressly for use with foreign transactions. And no one realized the purpose of that. It wasn't so much to not infect or to isolate the Cuban from these bourgeois and capitalist values, but it was to maintain poverty and control. So effectively, they created this economic apartheid. And unfortunately, what would occur perniciously over the years is that this would become a racial apartheid. The Cuban regime, the military, by the way, let's be absolutely clear for your listeners and the people watching this. Cuba is not necessarily some poor socialist country trying to do good by its people. Cuba is run by a white male military dictatorship, and they insulate themselves from any accountability to the Cuban people through an enormous bureaucracy called the Cuban government. So they have this holding entity called GAESA, Grupo de Administración Empresarial S.A., which is like Inc. S.A. is. So it's the business administration group, and it is run by Raul Castro's longtime son-in-law, who I understand now is divorced from his oldest daughter. So it's more of a criminal organization. Now, what's pertinent for Americans is that there's only one buyer and seller of anything in Cuba, and that is the Cuban state, and oftentimes GAESA. So an American business has to do all transactions with the GAESA or the state, and they have to do so in this second currency. The Cubans take that money and pay Cuban employees in the second worthless currency, the national money, that's worth, at the time was worth about 4 cents to the dollar. And they paid the Cuban worker as if the two were equal. And that's why you see Cubans who had these incomes, monthly incomes of $20, $25, and $30, they're actually receiving thousands of pesos, but their purchasing power was almost none. Now, the Cuban military decided that we want white people to be kind of the face of the industry. And so you had professionals who spent all this time getting educated, and that's mostly whites in Cuba, got jobs as the managers and the tour guides and so forth. And unfortunately, Afro-Cubans were regulated to the menial jobs. So those who were giving a tour, for example, could keep tips in the good currency. So it's not uncommon for your cab driver or your waiter to be a neurosurgeon or a lawyer or engineer. they've quit doing whatever they were doing so they can have access to the tips. By the way, they also have relatives in Miami who are sending them money. And that's critical because in Cuba, the number 3 source of income are remittances from family members outside of Cuba to family within Cuba. And unfortunately, 98% of these are 90+% are Caucasian, are white. So the Afro-Cuban is excluded from that dynamic. The second largest source of income, and by the way, the remittances are about $3 billion a year, and they go into a particular bank. They have to be sent to a particular bank run by the Cuban military, and the Cuban military takes 10%. And then they then feed that, maybe that much, 90%, to the intended target. The second, and that's about $3 billion a year. The second largest source of income for the Cubans is not rum sales or sugar or anything like that. It's tourism. And, there were, as I said, maybe 80,000 tourists in Cuba in 1990, and there were 4 million in the last year of Mr. Obama's presidency. And so they were supporting the Cuban military, and that's the tune of about $4 billion a year. But the number 1 source of income, of revenue, hard currency, for the dictatorship has been human trafficking. And you may have seen that there are lawsuits now by Cuban doctors in exile and other groups against the Pan American Health Organization, for example, who basically was a broker. But the Cubans receive about $13 billion a year, sending doctors, social workers, nurses, teachers to third world countries who don't have this infrastructure. And so on the surface, it seems very humanitarian and necessary. And I'm sure they've done some good, but the money that is paid, it does not go to the doctor. It goes to the Cuban government or the military, and they then pay the doctor in the worthless currency. And by the way, they keep most of it in Havana with the doctor's family and require them to stay 2 years. And so it is nothing short of human trafficking. So what you see is that really this is a criminal organization. And, the reality is, and please interrupt me if I'm going on and on, but the reality is that this is essentially a criminal organization that we're dealing with. The people in Cuba know that it's not the embargo who beats them. It was very telling last week after the international pressure started to mount on the regime. The president of Cuba, Diaz-Canel, who, by the way, was made president, that really is for Western consumption to show the West and others that, Cuba has this sense of a democratic process. But Diaz-Canel admitted, he said, okay, well, we're going to lift restrictions on food and medicine to the people. Who knew? The narrative was, no, the restrictions were coming from the United States, but that's not true at all. The embargo to Cuba, the more serious one, is the embargo of goods and services by the military to the Cuban people. And this has gone on for years. And as I said, the Cubans are finally realizing that it's not American sanctions that are the cause of their misery. And this has been largely helped by the fact that about 2 or 3 years ago, the internet became more common in Cuba to the regular person. And they've been able to see what's happening on the outside and be in instant communication with relatives, for example, in Miami and the outside world.
I wanted to go back to kind of one of the observations you made around. I mean, one of the sort of rationales that you sometimes hear from apologists for the Cuban regime has been the quote Cuban healthcare system, and I'm sure you've heard that multiple times. And of course, as I heard you mention at the outset that one of the planks of the protesters' complaints has been concerns about healthcare. So I want to give you an opportunity to kind of elaborate on that, and I think maybe puncture the balloon, if you will, of some of the folks who try and justify the Cuban regime by their healthcare.
Yeah, so literacy was high before the revolution, but certainly was higher afterward. And there's been debate. I mean, do you really want to know to read and write if you only can read and write one opinion? But that having been said, the practical reality that the dictatorship was confronted with in the 60s was that there was enormous brain drain of the professional classes, engineers, doctors, lawyers. And the truth of the matter is whether the regime intended to or not, this created just the void, created tremendous opportunity for people of color in Cuba. If there was a benefit intended or not, that's certainly the case. Now, Cuban healthcare, again, the production of doctors for 50 years, 40 years has been, of course, to provide for the Cuban people, but also to export these people. And they've been doing that going back to the 70s, exporting Cuban physicians. When the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred, they also realized that they didn't need to necessarily export Cuban doctors. They could import patients and have medical tourism. And so this became a very prominent area of focus. But what happened was, of course, the medical tourists have to use the good currency and not the bad currency. And so Cuba created effectively a two-tiered healthcare system, an apartheid there. You go to a tourist hospital and you will see the latest MRIs, CT scans, but these are reserved exclusively for tourists and Communist Party elites. And by the way, the Communist Party makes up less than 10% of Cubans. So it's the Communist Party elites. Cubans, on the other hand, are required to go to their local hospital. These places are the filthiest buildings that you will see. They have no medications, they have no equipment. I went to Cuba in 1997 to go look at this property that I had inherited. And I had met a young neurosurgeon. My father had been a Cuban-American neurosurgeon, had been educated in Cuba, received a grant from the Cuban government to come to the United States in 1938. And he trained and became board certified here in the United States in neurosurgery. And he went back to Cuba and effectively modernized Cuban neurosurgery, created credentialing and so forth. And so I had met the nephew of one of his last trainees, who was a military neurosurgeon in Cuba, and he took me around to the different hospitals. And they had one drill, for example, again, something they could have easily bought from Germany. They wouldn't have needed to buy that from the United States. But they had one drill available in the hospital one day a week for all the services, the ear, nose, and throat, the neurosurgeons, the orthopedic surgeons. But really is in terrible situation. If a patient goes to a hospital, generally speaking, the doctor will say, look, you have this or that. I'm going to write down a list of things. You go out to the street in the black market and come up with these. If you come back, I'll treat you. So it's really a very sorry state. And here the Cubans are sending these doctors away to other countries where they're having a terrible time with the pandemic, certainly more recently. But that's the problem. Their statistics are very, very unreliable. They hid the Zika infection that they had several years ago. Journalists were put into prison for reporting on a cholera outbreak they had about 6 or 8 years ago. I mean, it's, they miss the bigger picture to try to preserve the narrative that of the excellence of Cuban healthcare. Cuba has good doctors. I'm not saying that not. They're not very. My experience with working them in exile, with them in exile, is that they're very well read. They're not particularly as experienced, if you will, probably because of the lack of equipment.
So the inequality really is one of the big challenges with the health.
Huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about what the future is. What do you see as the sort of end game? What are the opportunities that we have?
Well, I mean, if I wish I knew that for certain. I will tell you that what has allowed the Cubans to hold on, of course, for 40 years was the cult of personality of Fidel Castro. Fidel has this aura about him, and quite frankly, in many parts of the world, people love Fidel Castro for no other reason is that he regularly kicks Uncle Sam in the shins. And somebody once told me you could divide the world into two groups: those are who pro-American and who are anti-American. And really, it's more establishment and anti-establishment. But the reality is that the United States of America represents the establishment. And that was who Fidel was all these years. Raul was more of a pragmatic leader, but he had the halo effect of being Fidel's brother. He also had the benefit of being known to be ruthless, and so Raul was not one you wanted to cross. But he was a more effective administrator than Fidel, and kind of held things together until recently. The issue with Raul is one of succession, and it is widely thought that he wants his son to take over after him, Alejandro. Alexander is a colonel. He may be a general by now in the military. He fought in Africa, lost an eye, not in battle. I think he tripped on a rock and hit his eye. And he wrote a book in the year or two prior to the Obama opening, which he helped negotiate, called The Empire of Terror. And if you have any doubt about who he was referring to, it was the United States of America. There's a big bald eagle in red, white, and blue holding a globe in its talons. He was also in charge of the Cuban intelligence services during the crisis or the attacks on U.S. diplomats in Havana. And of course, there's a lot of speculation about what was going on with that. The common word on the street is that he's a hardliner and was skeptical about motives by the United States, and was trying to come up with some intel on useful intel for the others to say, look, this is not such a good idea to be opening up too quickly to these people. This has to be a controlled engagement, if you will. And as you know, the Cubans, and even John Kerry admitted that it had been a big disappointment. The United States had shown good faith with the Cubans and gave them a lot of concessions that they did not deserve. And the Cubans made really few substantive representations about what they would be willing to do with regard to political prisoners and so forth. And nothing happened on their end. In fact, repression increased. It was with impunity, because they had just received the imprimatur of the President of the United States in Havana and at a baseball game doing the wave with a man who's killed God knows how many people with his own hands.
Let me go back, because I think you were referencing what is sort of, in some circles, I guess, described as a sort of microwave bombarding of American facility. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. Excuse me, sorry about that. So that was that's my wife who's calling in. I'm sorry, she's out of town. Excuse me, let me get this. Yeah, this occurred. This was thought to be a sonic or microwave attack on U.S. personnel at that time, the embassy. It still is the embassy, but there was a question about whether these people were actually embedded CIA agents in the embassy. But they heard different loud booms or noises or vibrating, like you might hear if you've ever had an MRI. And basically, it is thought to be pulse ultrasonic waves going to the brain, damaging the nerve tracts, the fibers from the neurons to the end organ, like the ear, for example, the eardrum. And this is technology that, ironically, the Cubans have been working on for about 10 or 15 years with Russian subsidies at that point. And if you like conspiracy theories, the scientist who was in charge of that was none other than Fidelito Castro, who was Fidel's oldest son, who was a physicist. And he had been in charge of that. And about a few months after the first injury was exposed or discovered, Fidelito committed suicide. Now, although there was no apparent history of mental illness, I think his last public appearance was with Paris Hilton at a Havana bar, living it up. Cubans historically have had one of the highest suicide rates in the world. So who knows? And it would only be speculating. But it is a coincidence that this was a project he was working on in Cuba on high frequency microwaves, and that his first cousin was a director of security intelligence operations in Cuba.
So is the suggestion that they were trying to eavesdrop or just to, in effect, damage?
No, I think that's the case. My suspicion is that they were not looking to injure anyone, although they may not have appreciated the danger in the technology they were using. I think they were trying to get information. The Cubans are really that's one of their strengths. If they would put a fraction of the energy and money into civil services that they put into high-tech surveillance, you can go into one of the rundown neighborhoods in Havana, and there'll be no covers for the sewers or drains, but up on the street light will be a $250,000 camera for observation.
Now, you referenced the fact that the impact of the internet has been to make, I think you're suggesting that more aware as to what was happening in the outside world, and that may, I'm trying to put words, I'm just kind of following up on it, have been one of the impetus to the unrest that's taking place more recently. Could you elaborate kind of, part of it is I compare that with what's happening in China, where increasingly the internet has become also a tool of very much the secret police of the security state to impose the will of the state on folks. Talk about where the internet is in China and in Cuba, I'm sorry, and what effects it's having.
Yeah, so I think we all can agree that information is absolutely essential. And one of the issues that's been longstanding in the 80s, in fact, Reagan began to appropriate money for something called radio and TV Marti. We would be sending signals to Cuba so that Cubans could watch an alternative news channel to the one state-run channel that they had. And of course, the Cubans have jammed that and blocked it over the years, but we've still managed to get through to them. More recently, obviously, the internet. Now, the Cubans very, very tightly forbid the internet for the longest time. There's really only been internet service in Cuba, I want to say maybe 10 or 12 years. And that was exclusively for upper level Communist Party elites and for tourists. The cost per hour for a Cuban, I want to say at one point was about $4 or $5 an hour. And when you make $20 a month, that's a big bite out of your budget. But and that was one of the things that Mr. Obama was pushing, and certainly the different Google and Facebook and all these people and AT&T and Verizon were interested in pursuing in Cuba, but really it was the Cuban state that would never sign a contract to get these people in. And the perception is that somehow so-called right-wing extremists or exiles, like many Cubans out of Cuba, were holding this back, but nothing could be further from the truth. The biggest weapon, as you saw it 10 days ago in Havana, was the fact that through the internet, through Twitter and so forth, people were able to see what was happening from one city to the other and mobilize and have more concerted effort. And the impact of that, as you can see, was dramatic, because these weren't isolated events per se, but they all came from the same visceral impulse that everyone was having. Now,
periods of unrest in the past in Cuba have resulted in mass migration, I think it's fair to say. There have been various waves over a period of time. How should do you see that happening and how should the Biden administration respond? And that's actually touches on obviously immigration or asylum policy, or the difference of asylum policy here in the United States.
Yeah, so that is, in my view, certainly one scenario here. My biggest fear is that we were going to have, or may still have, a Tiananmen Square type of event, and with then a huge migration. Historically, as you referenced, particularly specifically in 1980 with the Mariel boat lift, and in the mid 90s with the rafter crisis. That was how Fidel basically kind of let the gas out of the pressure cooker. And if you weren't happy here, then go to the United States. And interestingly, he took the opportunity in 1980 to empty the prisons and the sanitariums. And when I say empty, I don't mean just open the door and let whoever run out. Fidel went through every file himself. And, murderer, yeah, he can go. Rapist, he can go. Child molester, send him to. Criticize the state. No, he stays and does his 30 years in prison. So, he was very shrewd about that. I think, there already is a migration crisis happening at our southern border that has Cubans with it. The Cubans now don't jump on a raft anymore and cross the Straits of Florida. Some you see in these medical missions, but many of them pay coyotes to leave Cuba and go to Mexico or get into South America, and then they work their way up through the Northern Triangle and through Mexico to our southern border. So there is kind of an ongoing issue with that, but that certainly is one possibility. But I think the Cubans today in Cuba, unlike maybe in my parents' generation when we came in 1960, I think the Cubans, as I said at the outset, have nothing more left to lose. They've lost their fear to complain, and we'll see how the regime manages going forward. I think there is probably a lot of internal strife or conflict in the group that runs Cuba. And when I say that, we're not talking about the Politburo or the Central Committee. We're talking about the 15, 20, maybe 25 generals in the military who are kind of shepherding Cuba through this. And my hope is that one of them feels that it's their turn and is not Alejandro Castro's turn, and that he will join forces with the West or the United States or the rest of the hemisphere. Let me just make a comment though about the embargo, because I think we have to be really clear about this. This is an issue of U.S. sovereignty. They have stolen property from us. They have terrorized our citizens. People don't realize the Cubans a plot was foiled 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. In 1962, Che Guevara and Raul Castro were going to blow up Bloomingdale's, Grand Central Station. They found, I don't know how many hundreds of pounds of TNT the FBI did and foiled that plot. The Cubans have exported their revolution and destabilized the entire hemisphere. They have promoted narco trafficking. It is in the best interest of this hemisphere to see the change in Cuba with regard to the dictatorship. But the embargo is a question of our sovereignty. We have no legitimate commercial interests doing business with this military dictatorship, this kleptocracy. The size of the Cuban economy is 10% of that of Dade County. 10% of that of Dade County. It is nothing. The monies they spent buying agricultural products in the Obama years was purely to get local businessmen to say, wow, go to their congressman. This was so good, lift the embargo because we want to sell more. Well, the problem with lifting the embargo and is that the Cubans are going to get credit. And who's going to end up paying for this? This is just big corporate welfare. The U.S. taxpayer will. So, this is really kind of in my view, a critical element here, that the embargo is U.S. policy, in that it's something that we just don't need to be dealing with the Cubans, with the Cuban dictatorship. We should support the Cuban people, and I think we do in certain ways, but ultimately change will have to come from them. What our role is, saying exiles like me, is to create the conditions that make this more likely.
Well, we're actually coming up to what is our normal end, which is about 45 minutes. And I have to say that was a rather eloquent conclusion. We certainly hope that there's, how shall I say, I think we all remember the joy when the wall came down in Berlin, sort of the outpouring of the sense of relief about freedom, and it certainly has led to the integration of East Germany with West Germany into the unified Germany, and I think we would all pray and hope for something similar to happen in Cuba. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to add, the irony of it all was to see Cubans protesting in Havana draped in the American flag. Think about that for a moment. Everywhere in the world, it is a symbol of peace and freedom. Maybe not here so much, but certainly for them. And we certainly don't see migration from the United States, despite all that you see and hear. And we have our issues for sure.
I'm impressed that anybody had an American flag in Havana. I would have thought that was a bit of a challenge. But thank you very much. It's been a very informative, fun talk, and we look forward to hearing from you again under maybe in the near future when we can report back on more positive developments.
Thank you very much. The pleasure's been mine. I really appreciate you having me.
Right.
Thank you. Good night.